There's something uniquely terrifying about being followed in the wilderness. Because out there is no crowd to disappear into, no door to lock behind you. Just miles of dense tree cover, no cell signal, and the growing certainty that the sounds behind you are not the mountain settling. These are 15 real accounts from the Appalachian backcountry. 15 separate stories where someone went into the woods and realized at some point that they had not been alone since the beginning. Not one of these people could fully explain what was following them, but every single one of them knew, without question, that it was deliberate. Story 1, The Tenant, submitted by Aaron, late 30s, Tennessee. I want to start by saying I have been hunting in the Cumberland Plateau my entire life. My father hunted it. His father hunted it before him. I know those woods the way most people know their own neighborhood. The shortcuts, the weird spots, the natural features that don't change year to year, or the deer yard up in cold snaps, or the turkey's dust in the dry months. I say that not to brag, but because I want you to understand that when I tell you something was wrong up there, I'm not someone who spooks easily, and I'm not someone who misreads the forest. I've been hunting the same general territory since I was 16 years old. I had my first deer stand at 17. The piece of land I hunt now is mostly public, with a strip of private that I have permission to cross. I know it down to individual trees. When something is out of place out there, I notice it the way you'd notice a piece of furniture moved in your living room. This was 3 autumns ago. I had a deer stand about 6 miles into the backcountry, accessed by a Forest Service road that gets gated off every November 1st. I try to get one last weekend in before the gate closes, just me and my rifle, and however many days I feel like staying. Usually 2 nights, sometimes 3 if the rut is running hot. I drove in on a Friday evening after work, got to the trailhead with about an hour of light left, and hiked to my base camp. It's a spot I've been using for probably 15 years. There's a flat shelf of rock next to a spring-fed creek, just wide enough for a tent and the small fire ring I built myself years ago out of flat sandstone pieces that I carried in one at a time. That fire ring took me 4 trips to complete, and I'm absurdly proud of it. It feels more like home than a lot of places I've actually lived. I got in, set up in the last of the fading light, boiled some water for a freeze-dried meal, and was in my sleeping bag by 8:30. Nothing strange that first night. The woods sounded right. Temperature dropped the way it should. I slept hard and woke up before my alarm. I was in the stand before first light Saturday morning. Sat until 9. Saw a doe and 2 yearlings well out of range, a few squirrels, nothing worth shooting. Came back to camp around noon, and that's when I noticed it. The flat stones from my fire ring had been moved. Not scattered, not knocked over like a deer had bumped into the ring in the dark. They had been picked up and rearranged. The ring itself was gone, and the stones were laid out in a rough line, pointing toward the creek, which was maybe 20 feet away. 7 stones, evenly spaced, pointed like a compass needle. My first thought was other hunters, maybe teenagers who'd found the camp and messed with my stuff for entertainment. That kind of thing happens on public land. Annoying but not alarming. I didn't like it, but I didn't panic. I rebuilt the ring the way I always build it, replaced each stone in its original position from memory, and then I walked the perimeter of camp, looking for any other sign someone had been there. No trash, no boot prints in the mud near the creek that I couldn't account for. Nothing else disturbed. The tote with my food was untouched, still hanging from the bear cable I always rigged between 2 big oaks. I made a mental note to be more alert and went about my afternoon. Second day hunt was slow, saw nothing from the stand, got back to camp at dusk. Everything looked fine. It was that second night when something shifted. The feeling came on slowly enough that I almost didn't notice it at first. If you spend a lot of time in the woods, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's not a sound or a sight. It's more like pressure, an imbalance. The woods felt wrong in one direction. north of camp specifically. Everything else was fine. The creek sounded normal. The insects and small animals east and south of me were going about their business. But to the north, there was a pocket of complete silence that sat through the entire evening and didn't move. Animals avoid things. Insects go quiet near disturbance. A pocket of silence that holds its position for hours means something is in that area and it's not moving. I didn't go investigate. I ate, cleaned up, sat by my fire later than usual, listening. Nothing changed. That northern pocket stayed quiet until I finally gave up around 11 and crawled into my tent. I didn't sleep well. Not because I was scared exactly. More like my body refused to fully let go. I kept surfacing into partial wakefulness every hour or so. My rifle was in the tent with me, which is always the case on solo trips. And at some point around 4 in the morning, I realized I was holding it across my chest and I didn't remember reaching for it. Around 4:30, the silence broke. The northern pocket came back to life the way the woods should. Insects, small movements in the leaves, the sounds of a functioning forest. Like whatever had been there had left. I fell asleep for maybe 90 minutes before my alarm went off. I stepped out of my tent at first light and the dead rabbit was on my fire ring. Freshly dead. Not torn apart, not half-eaten like something had scavenged it. Placed there, belly up, in the center of the stones, positioned like an offering. There was no blood on the ground around the ring. Whatever had killed it had done so somewhere else and then carried it to my camp and set it down. I've processed a lot of animals in my life, and I know what fresh looks like. That rabbit had been dead less than an hour, which meant something had walked into my camp before sunrise, while I was awake and listening with a rifle across my chest, and left a freshly killed animal on my fire ring without making any sound that I heard. I stood there in the cold morning for a long time just looking at it. I want to be honest about what I felt. It wasn't fear exactly, it was something closer to violation. My camp, a place that felt more mine than most places I've been, had been entered and used as a surface to leave something on. Whatever did that was comfortable enough in my presence to operate at close range without hesitation. I packed up deliberately. Not rushing, not panicking. I made breakfast, drank my coffee, broke down the tent with the same care I always use. I didn't want to behave like prey, but I left. And the 6 miles back to the service road felt longer than they ever had. I stopped twice to look behind me. Saw nothing either time. Felt watched the entire way. I've been back to that stand twice since then. Both trips were completely normal hunts. Nothing out of place, good sign, no strange silences in the night. Whatever was interested in that spot seems to have moved on, or lost interest in me specifically. I rebuilt a different fire ring, both times 100 yards from the old one. I never rebuilt the original. Whatever left that rabbit, I've decided it can keep that piece of ground. Some places you just seed. Story 2. I want to be clear at the start about what kind of hiker I am because it's relevant to how I interpreted what happened. I'm not a weekend warrior. I've completed 2 full sections of the Mountains to Sea Trail. I've done solo sections of the Long Trail in Vermont, and I spend roughly 60 nights a year camping. I do not get rattled by wood sounds. I do not mistake branches for footsteps or wind for voices. I've been in bear encounters and handled them properly. I know what I'm doing out there. That's the context for this. Last spring, I did a solo section hike on the Art Loeb Trail in Pisgah National Forest. It's a 40-plus mile trail through the Shining Rock Wilderness and the Davidson River corridor. I'd done pieces of it before with various friends, but never that specific central stretch alone, and never in early April when the temperatures still swing hard between day and night. I had good gear and a solid plan, and I went prepared for what the conditions would be. Day 1 was straightforward. I covered close to 13 miles, set up camp on a ridgeline with a view, and slept well despite the cold. Morning of day 2, I was up before 6, broke camp by 7, and started south toward a gap I needed to get through before the afternoon thunderstorms the forecasts had suggested might be building. The trail drops sharply into a gap and then climbs back up, and the descent takes you through old forest with good canopy cover and a lot of exposed root systems on the trail surface that make you watch your feet. I was moving at a comfortable pace and thinking about the weather more than anything else when I first heard it. Footsteps behind me, consistent and rhythmic, maybe 20 yards back on the trail. I stopped. They stopped. Started walking. They started again. My immediate and entirely rational first assumption was another hiker. The art lobe gets traffic even in early season, and plenty of people do sections of it. But something was wrong with the sound. It's hard to describe to someone who hasn't spent a lot of time listening to footsteps in forests. But human footsteps have a natural irregularity to them. The weight shifts, the stride length varies slightly, people step around roots and rocks. There's a natural rhythm, but it's an organic one. These footsteps had none of that variability. Same interval, same weight every single step. Mechanical almost, the way a metronome is more regular than any human drummer. I turned around quickly the way you do when you're hoping to catch someone following you. The trail behind me was empty, just the descending path and the forest on both sides and the sounds of a normal spring morning. I started walking again. The footsteps came back within about 40 seconds. Over the next 2 miles, I stopped 4 more times. Every time the footsteps stopped with me. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there. I even tried doubling back quickly once, actually reversing course and moving back up the trail at a brisk walk for about 50 yards to see if I could come up on whatever it was from the front. The footsteps stopped when I reversed direction, and I found an empty trail for as far as I could see. I spent those 2 miles cycling through acoustic explanations. Sound reflection off a ridge, some natural feature creating an echo, a paralleling stream, loose trail surface that shifted under delayed settling. None of those held up under real examination. An echo doesn't stop when you stop. A stream doesn't match your walking pace exactly. The trail surface was packed earth and roots, not gravel. The footsteps stopped completely at a creek crossing. I stepped onto the log bridge and heard them stop on the near bank behind me. I crossed the creek and waited on the far side. Nothing crossed. I waited 5 minutes and then kept walking, and the footsteps did not resume. I made camp that night about a mile past the creek, set up my tent in a flat spot between 2 big hemlocks, cooked dinner, sat outside until it was full dark. Heard nothing unusual. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to what I was certain was breathing outside my tent. Not animal breathing. This was slower and more deliberate. It had the cadence of human breathing, right at the tent wall, measured and quiet like someone trying to be careful about the sound they were making. Very close, maybe a foot or 2 from the nylon. I did not move. This was a conscious decision. I've been in enough situations to know that revealing you're awake can change dynamics, and not always for the better. I gripped the knife I keep in my sleeping bag and counted my own heartbeats, because I needed to keep my mind from going to unhelpful places. I got to somewhere around 300 before the breathing stopped. I did not sleep again after that. When first light came, I got up and looked around. Nobody there. Nothing around the camp. But in the soft mud near the creek edge, 6 or 7 feet from where I'd been sleeping, there were footprints. Bare human feet, no shoe tread, both feet visible in clear impression, toes pointing toward my tent. They came from the direction of the water, and they stopped where I found them. There were no prints leading away from that spot. Something had walked within feet of my tent in the dark, stood there long enough to be heard breathing, and then left no outgoing tracks. I completed my section hike. I don't bail on things, and I wasn't going to start. But I have not gone back to that particular stretch of the art lobe since then. What I spend time on is the footprints, not the footsteps on the trail, which I can almost convince myself had some acoustic explanation on a good day. The footprints Footprints that arrived and didn't leave. I can't build any explanation for that at all. Story 3. The Smell of It. Submitted by Marcus 33, West Virginia. I work for a timber company doing site assessments and boundary surveys. What that means practically is that I spend a very large portion of my working life alone in remote West Virginia forest, navigating by GPS and paper maps, covering ground that sees almost no foot traffic. I've done this for 9 years. I've logged more hours in serious backcountry than most people who would describe themselves as outdoorsmen. I've seen bears up close enough to smell. I've had a mother bear come at me and had to back her down. I know the sounds and smells and movement patterns of the animals in those forests better than most people know the animals in their own backyards. When I tell you what I smelled that afternoon in the Monongahela, I want you to understand that I'm not someone given to sensory misinterpretation. This was 2 summers ago. I was doing a boundary assessment for a private timber tract that butted up against the Monongahela National Forest on its western edge. No trails in that area, just old survey lines cut maybe 30 years ago. Still navigable, but overgrown. I'd been working the line since early morning and was maybe 4 miles in when I stepped into the smell. It hit me like a wall. The best description I can give is decomposing animal. That thick, sweet rot you get from something large that's been dead for days in summer heat. But underneath that was something else. Something alive smelling, if that makes sense. Musky and heavy, almost chemical, like ammonia cut with something biological. I've smelled bear up close, and it has a quality to it, but this was nothing like that. This was an order of magnitude more intense and more complex. I stopped immediately and stood still. No wind. The forest was completely quiet around me, which was its own alarm. This was a section of woods with a lot of bird activity earlier in the morning. Now it was completely silent, nothing moving anywhere within earshot. I turned around slowly. There was a figure in the old survey line, 30 yards behind me. The light in survey lines is different from the surrounding forest because the canopy opens up above the cleared corridor and you get a kind of diffused brightness that doesn't exist in closed canopy sections. This figure was in that corridor, in that diffuse light, and I could see it clearly enough to know it was there. What I couldn't do was make out detail because it was in shadow on the far side of the bright corridor. What I registered immediately was the height, very tall, and the proportions were wrong. I know how a tall person looks from 30 yards away. Their shoulders and chest fill out in proportion to their height. This figure was too narrow for how tall it was. The shape was elongated in a way that didn't fit any person I could imagine, and it was not moving. I've had plenty of moments in the woods where I've stared at something and tried to figure out if it's a person or a stump or a shadow. Those moments resolve quickly. You look at it differently, or the light shifts, or the thing moves. This didn't resolve. The more I looked at it, the more certain I became that it was a figure, and the more uncomfortable the proportions became. I called out, gave my company name, and the fact that I was a contractor on an authorized assessment. Standard practice when you're on private land near neighbors. Nothing. I called out again, specifically asked if they needed assistance. Nothing. Then I took one step toward it. That's when it moved. Not running, not the way a startled animal bolts. It stepped sideways. A lateral step into the tree line off the survey corridor. And then it was gone. No crash of brush, no breaking of branches. A figure that tall and that close to me stepped off a survey line into closed canopy forest and made essentially no sound doing it. I radioed my field supervisor from that exact spot, told him what I'd seen. He pulled my GPS coordinates and told me to head back to the service road. The smell stayed with me for maybe a quarter mile before I walked out of whatever concentration of it had been around that area of the survey line. My supervisor met me at the site the next morning with 2 other crew members. We walked the line together back to that spot. The smell was gone completely. But when we looked at the edge of the tree line where the figure had stepped off, the ground was soft enough to show some sign. Not footprints exactly, the soil had too much root structure for clear prints. But the leaf cover at that edge was disturbed in a way that hadn't happened naturally, and there were soil compressions in the soft spots between roots that none of us could match to a known animal track. The disturbed area was large. My supervisor, a man named Dale, who has been working timber country in West Virginia for 26 years, stood at that spot for a long time without saying anything. Then he told me to mark the coordinates, and we moved on. We finished the assessment over the next 3 days without incident. The other 2 crew members started doubling up on travel after that, not as an official policy, just quietly. Nobody wanting to work alone in that particular section. In that line of work, you learn quickly that some places in those mountains are just wrong, and you finish what you came to do and you don't linger. Story 4. I'm a search and rescue volunteer with a county team based in the Shenandoah Valley. I have been doing this work for 6 years, and I want to be very deliberate about establishing that context, because it matters for what I'm about to describe. SAR volunteers see the worst of what the wilderness produces. We find disoriented elderly hikers and hypothermia patients, and occasionally people who are beyond recovery. After 6 years of that, there's not much in the outdoor world that unnerves me. I'm not a person who sees things in the woods and reaches for supernatural explanations. The call came in on a Tuesday evening in October of last year. Overdue hiker, backcountry loop in George Washington National Forest. The subject was a 62-year-old man, experienced, had completed this specific loop before, and registered his itinerary with a family contact who called us when he didn't reach the trailhead by his stated return window. His car was there, 18 hours overdue. We had 2 teams in the field by 10 that night. My team, 4 of us, was assigned to a grid sweep of the off-trail terrain east of the loop, an area of rough laurel thickets and rocky creek drainages that tends to trap people who lose the trail and try to shortcut. Our other team took the established routes. 2 hours into the grid, we found a camp that did not belong to the subject. The location was the first unusual thing, 3 miles minimum from any established trail, in a section of the forest that has no legal primitive camping designation and no reason for anyone to be there. No trailhead access, no road access, nothing. Getting to that spot required either knowing the terrain very well or spending a lot of time moving through dense forest without a path. The camp itself consisted of a fire pit with cold ash, a blue tarp stretched tightly between 2 oaks at about 7 feet off the ground, and underneath the tarp a collection of gear. Camp stove, fuel canisters, a dry bag, a stuff sack that appeared to contain clothing, 2 empty water bottles, and a third that still had water in it. The tarp was rigged well. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. None of that was what disturbed me. What disturbed me was the perimeter. At a radius of roughly 10 feet from the fire pit, running all the way around the camp in a circle, there were branches pushed into the ground, upright like fence posts, stripped of every leaf. I counted 31 of them. They were evenly spaced, maybe a foot apart, and they'd been placed carefully, pushed deep enough into the soil to stand without support. They formed a nearly perfect circle around the camp. I've been in hundreds of camps. I've seen every configuration of tarps and shelters and fire setups imaginable. I've never seen anything like that circle, and I don't have an explanation for its function. There was no one in the camp. We photographed everything and called it into base, and then kept moving. We found our subject about a mile further east, exactly where I expected him to be, in a drainage where he'd gone down a slope in the dark and put his knee out. He was cold and scared and had been sitting in that drainage for about 14 hours. We got him stabilized and started the extraction. On the extraction route, we passed within visual range of the camp. It was maybe 100 yards off our line, and I looked over at it as we passed. The tarp was gone. The fire pit was still there. The ring of stripped branches was still there. But everything under the tarp had been removed. Every piece of gear, every water bottle, the stuff sack, all of it, gone. We had been in that part of the forest for less than 2 hours. Nobody on either team had seen or heard another person. Nobody had come through on any of the game trails or drainages we'd covered. I filed a complete report and included the GPS coordinates. Forest Service sent a ranger to check within the week. They found the fire pit and the branch circle. Everything else had been removed before they got there as well. The ranger told me it was probably an illegal hunting camp, and they'd keep monitoring the area. Maybe. I've documented illegal hunting camps before as part of SAR work. They don't look like that. They don't have 31 stripped branches arranged in a measured circle. And they don't vanish their own gear within 2 hours of being found by a search team in the middle of the night without anyone hearing movement. Our subject had been moving through that drainage for most of the night before we found him. He'd been within half a mile of that camp. He told me afterward that he'd seen a light at some point during the night, a single light in the trees, and he'd thought about moving toward it, but decided to stay put instead. He said the light had moved away before he could decide. I didn't tell him what we'd found, and I'm glad he stayed put. Story 5. My wife has a running joke that I'm allergic to feelings. She means it affectionately. I'm an engineer by training and by temperament. I like systems, and I like problems that have solutions, and I trust data over intuition almost always. I mention this because the experience I had in the Red River Gorge 2 years ago produced a data point I cannot resolve, and it has bothered me the way only unresolved problems do. The other relevant thing is my dog. Her name is Hatch. She's a Catahoula. She just turned 8, and she's been backpacking with me since she was 4 months old. Catahoulas are working dogs bred for difficult terrain and high-stress situations, and Hatch lives up to the breed. In 8 years, she has charged a black bear without flinching, walked off a 3-day 50-mile trip without limping, and never once spooked at weather or wildlife or darkness. When she's alert to something, she does one thing: lowers her head, plants her feet, and produces a growl from somewhere around her toes. Controlled, directed, effective. It has never been excessive. I took her on a 4-day trip in the Red River Gorge in early June. The first 2 days were excellent. Good temperatures, good mileage, Hatch ranging out ahead and circling back at regular intervals, the way she does when she's happy. Third day, we took an unmaintained side trail heading south from the main corridor into a section of forest I hadn't explored before. Old growth mixed forest, a lot of tulip poplar and hemlock, the light filtered and diffuse under a thick canopy. Hatch was off leash and moving freely. Around 11 in the morning, without any warning or precursor, Hatch stopped. Full stop. All 4 feet planted. Rigid from nose to tail. She was facing into the forest on our left, maybe 30 degrees off the trail. And she was looking at something, not doing the bear thing. Head wasn't lowered, no growl. She was just completely and entirely still. And she was trembling. In 8 years, I had never seen her tremble. She doesn't tremble. She's not that kind of dog. But her whole body was vibrating with something she was holding back. She wanted to move in the direction she was facing, and she was actively overriding it. And whatever the internal war was, it was costing her. I stood with her for a few minutes and tried to see what she was looking at. Trees, undergrowth, normal forest as far as I could tell. I tried to get her to move forward on the trail. She refused. Took a step toward the forest in the direction she was staring, looked at me, looked back, took another step. In 8 years, she has never tried to lead me somewhere. This was something else. I put her on leash and followed her line. She moved slowly and deliberately through the undergrowth, not crashing through it the way she normally does off trail. more careful. We went 80 yards from the trail before she stopped and sat down. There was a deer in a small clearing, a doe dead lying on her side, and she had been placed there. Her legs had been straightened and set against her body. Her head had been positioned with her chin on the ground facing east. Around her in a circle about 4 feet wide, the leaf cover had been completely removed. The ground inside that circle was bare soil, scraped clean. The bare soil circle bothered me more than the deer. Removing the leaf cover from a patch of forest ground that size is not a quick or easy task. You're pulling up layers of leaf litter, some of it compressed and partially composted, working it away from roots and rocks. Whoever had done it cleanly. The edge of the bare circle was sharp. Leaves up to the line, nothing past it. Hatch sat 3 feet behind me while I looked at this. She would not go closer. In 8 years of backpacking, she has shown up at hundreds of dead animals and eaten plenty of things I wished she hadn't. She would not approach this one. I went back to the trail. We moved faster for the rest of the afternoon. Hatch stayed close instead of ranging out. She slept pressed against me that night instead of at the tent door, where she usually positions herself. She didn't finish her dinner, which for a working dog on a high mileage day is genuinely unusual. I've taken her back to the gorge twice since that trip, and she's been completely normal on both occasions. But I think about that deer circle more than I've thought about most things that have happened to me in the outdoors. The construction of it, the effort behind it. Whoever built that arrangement in that clearing had a purpose for it, and I do not know what that purpose was. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've spent time in the Appalachian backcountry and something happened that you've never been able to explain, I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments or use the submission link pinned below. I read everything that comes in. Story 6, Below the Ridge, submitted by Carla, 39, Tennessee. There are 2 versions of this story. The version I told people at the time and the version I've never told anyone. I'm going to tell you the second one here. The version I told people was that I had a rough night on the Cumberland Trail, heard some sounds outside my tent that I couldn't identify, didn't sleep well, and hiked out the next morning. That version is true as far as it goes. It just leaves out the most important part. I was doing a solo weekend in October on the section of the Cumberland Trail that drops below a long ridge into a narrow valley. I've hiked this section probably a dozen times over the years. The valley is narrow and the ridgelines rise sharply on both sides, and the creek through the bottom is loud enough in high water to fill the whole hollow. I love that section. This was perfect fall weather. Clear skies, mid-40s at night, the leaves just past peak. I made camp in the valley bottom on a flat bench above the creek, a spot I'd used before, and had a good evening. Dinner, a book by headlamp, asleep before 9:30. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. I don't know what time, I don't sleep with my phone out. The creek was running the way it always does, and nothing seemed wrong at first. I lay there for a moment doing the usual inventory, listening to the sounds around me. Then I looked through the mesh of my tent fly. There was a person sitting at the edge of my camp, not standing. Sitting on the ground, cross-legged, maybe 20 feet from my tent, beyond the dead ring of my fire. I could see the shape clearly because that night happened to be bright enough that the moon through the bare canopy gave real visibility. An adult human figure sitting very still, facing my tent. I want to be precise about my state of consciousness. I was fully awake. I had been lying still and listening for at least a minute before I looked out. My eyes were adjusted to the dark. I was not groggy or in that half-dream state where things get mistaken for other things. I sat up in my sleeping bag and looked again, and the shape was there. I did not call out. Something in me said very clearly not to. Not a dramatic inner warning, just a quiet certainty that staying quiet was the correct choice. So I sat up and watched the figure, and the figure didn't move. Not at all. No shifting, no fidgeting. A person sitting cross-legged on cold ground in the middle of the night doesn't stay perfectly still. People move. They adjust their position. They scratch themselves. They breathe in ways that show. This shape was stone still. It sat there and looked at my tent, and I sat in my tent and looked at it. And nothing changed for what I estimate was close to 20 minutes. I decided to use my headlamp. I unzipped the inner mesh slowly, took a breath, pointed the lamp at the spot where the figure had been sitting, and switched it on. Nothing was there. The ground was empty. I swept the light in every direction, into the trees to the north, south, east, down toward the creek. Empty forest. Not a person walking away. Not a shadow moving at the edge of the light. Nothing. I sat up until dawn with my knife in my hand. At first light, I got up, went to the spot where the figure had been sitting. There was a clear oval of flattened grass there. A distinct impression. The kind of compression you get when something has been sitting on vegetation for an extended period. I packed up and left. I've hiked that section twice since, and both times were completely normal. What I told people was a stomach bug kept me up, and I cut the trip short. The shape on the ground is what I told nobody until now. The reason is simple. A cross-legged human figure that sits motionless for 20 minutes, watching a tent, and then vanishes without sound or trace. The instant a light comes on is a sentence that, once said, ends a conversation badly. The flattened grass is the part that keeps me up. You can question what I saw. You can't question an impression in the ground. Story 7. I want to be upfront about my background because it's relevant. I did 2 tours in the Army, including a deployment in a forward operating environment. I've been in situations involving genuine danger, and I have a reasonably calibrated sense of what warrants fear and what doesn't. I'm not someone who jumps at shadows, and I'm not someone who reads threat into normal things. What happened at my hunting blind 2 seasons ago genuinely unsettled me. And I want you to understand that unsettlement is not something I come to easily. I have a permanent ground blind in a section of the Nantahala National Forest in North Carolina. I built it myself 11 years ago, and I've maintained it every season since. It's a wood frame structure, 8 feet by 8, solid construction with 3 narrow shooting windows on the north, east, and west walls, and a door on the south. The whole thing sits in a saddle between 2 ridges with excellent deer movement on both sides. It holds 2 hunters, but I always hunted alone. Opening week of rifle season. I arrived at the blind before first light on a Monday morning and got settled in with my thermos and my rifle and the particular quiet patience that the stand demands. I've sat in that blind for something like 300 hours over 11 seasons. I know it sounds intimately. The first 2 hours were normal. Good morning sounds, a couple of shots from other hunters somewhere to the east. Around 20 minutes after first light, I heard something approaching through the brush from the northeast. Heavy movement, not fast. I angled my attention toward the northeast shooting window and watched the tree line. The movement got closer and slowed, and then it stopped just outside the north wall of the blind. I heard breathing right at the exterior of that wall. Not on the roof, not at a distance. At the wall itself, maybe 6 inches of wood between whatever was breathing and my position inside. It was slow, deliberate breathing, and I want to be specific. It did not sound like a deer or a bear or any animal I've encountered in that forest. It had the measured cadence of human breathing. Then, 3 knocks, deliberate, unhurried, knuckle on wood. Not loud, almost polite in volume, like someone knocking at a door in a library. My body went completely still, and something at a level below conscious reasoning said to stay quiet. I don't know why. It didn't feel like fear exactly. It felt like the right choice. I sat without responding for about 30 seconds. Then 3 more knocks, same cadence, identical timing to the first 3. A long silence. Then the breathing, and then the sound of something moving away from the blind, back through the brush to the northeast, unhurried, the same measured pace it had arrived with. In about 30 seconds, the sound was gone. I stayed in that blind for another 2 hours. I did not shoot anything. I could not concentrate on the sight lines. When I came out at mid-morning and went around to the north side of the blind, the brush had been pressed back against the wall in a way that indicated something large had been standing right there. There was a soft section of earth at the base of the wall, and there were no boot prints in it, no impressions that matched any animal I know in those mountains. I returned to that blind 4 more times that season. Nothing like it happened again. What I started doing before each hunt was knocking from the inside. 3 knocks before I settled in. I can't explain that impulse. It felt like an acknowledgement, like I was letting something know I was there, not announcing myself to other hunters, but something else entirely. Some kind of reciprocal gesture to whatever had been outside that wall. Nothing ever knocked back. On balance, I think I'm glad. Story 8, 30 miles in, submitted by Nick 29, Virginia/West Virginia border. Context matters here, so I'm going to give you some. Between the ages of 22 and 28, I did 14 extended solo trips in the Allegheny Highlands and adjacent wilderness areas along the Virginia-West Virginia border. Not weekend trips, not short sections. 8-day trips, 12-day trips. Starting at a road crossing, moving deep into roadless country, and working my way back. I kept detailed journals from almost all of these. After what happened on trip 14, I went back through those journals looking for anything I might have missed on earlier trips. On trips 7 and 11, I found brief notes about the feeling of being watched without a source. I'd written those off at the time. Trip 14. 7 days in, approximately 30 miles from the nearest maintained road. I'd been alone long enough that the interior noise of daily life had completely quieted, and I was operating in that particular state of heightened sensory clarity that only comes after a week of deep solitude. Around 2 in the afternoon on day 7, I came across a structure, not a collapsed trapper's cabin or rusted-out hunting shack. Something more recent and more intentional. It was built like a lean-to, but substantially constructed, not a thrown-together debris shelter. Cut timber, not forged branches. The logs had been squared with a tool. The cuts were deliberate. The roof was flat, a wood frame covered with heavy-gauge plastic sheeting that had been cut carefully and layered in overlapping strips for waterproofing. There were no walls on 3 sides, but the single back wall and the roof were solid. The floor was raised off the ground by a log platform to keep it dry. Someone who knew what they were doing had built this structure, and built it with intention. Inside on the raised floor, a folded wool blanket, a metal camp cup, a glass mason jar with a screw lid. The jar had food in it, dried fruit and what looked like strips of dried meat. I did the assessment that the situation called for. The blanket was clean and dry, not mildewed. The plastic sheeting had no algae growth. The food in the jar was intact. The structure had been visited and maintained recently, within weeks at most, more likely within days. Nobody builds a dry shelter with a raised floor and stocks it with food at 30 miles from any road without a plan. Whoever was responsible was either living in that wilderness on a semi-permanent basis or making regular supply runs to maintain the site. Neither of those was a comfortable thought in terms of the kind of person it described. I left everything exactly as I found it and moved on. Made camp about 3 miles further on a high bench with good sight lines. That night around midnight, I was reading in my tent when I heard footsteps on the ridge above my position. Clear, deliberate walking footsteps on rocky ground, moving in a single direction. Not a deer or bear, which have characteristic gait patterns I can identify from sound. These were bipedal, consistent stride, moderate pace. They moved along the ridgeline for maybe 4 minutes before the sound faded. I'd been on that ridge earlier in the day. There was no path there. It was a broken rocky spine through dense old forest. Not the kind of terrain anyone traverses casually, and absolutely not the kind anyone does in the dark without extraordinary familiarity with the ground. I broke camp early the next morning and did a longer day than planned to put more distance between myself and the shelter. On my way back through the area on day 9, I made a slight detour to check the shelter. The structure was still there. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, with one exception. The mason jar was gone. Story 9, The Third Night, submitted by Becca, 27, Georgia or Tennessee border. I'm going to start from the third night, because the first 2 nights are just context and you don't need them. Good weather, normal hiking, nothing unusual. That's days 1 and 2. I was in the Chattahoochee National Forest on a solo trip, the 3rd week of August. A section I know reasonably well, good backcountry density, low foot traffic in the areas I prefer. I'd covered 11 miles on day 3, and I was tired in the good way that makes sleep come fast. I found a campsite on a flat section of mixed forest, above a small creek drainage, somewhere I hadn't camped before. I got in late, cooked fast, and was in my tent before it was fully dark, because the miles had gotten into my legs. I woke up at some point in the deep middle of the night to a soft sound. It was rhythmic, coming from somewhere south of camp, at a distance I'd estimated 40 to 60 feet. Not loud at all, almost gentle in volume. What it was not, wind, which has its own arrhythmic quality. What it was not, the creek, which I could distinguish as a separate ambient background. What it was not, an animal moving through brush, which has an irregular pattern. This was an even metronomic repetition of a soft sound I couldn't immediately place. I got up and stood outside my tent with my headlamp off and listened. The sound continued. I walked toward it, slow and quiet in my camp shoes, maybe 40 feet from my tent. There was a person standing at the base of a tree, I know what I'm saying. I'm aware of how it sounds, and I'm telling you what I saw. A person, adult, at the base of a big poplar, facing the tree, doing something with their hands against the bark. The sound was coming from her hands on the wood. I couldn't see her face because she had her back to me. Her build and her hair were distinctly feminine. I said hello, a normal speaking voice. She turned around. I cannot tell you with accuracy what her face looked like in the dark because I had not yet turned on my headlamp. I can tell you she turned toward me, and she was looking at me, and she did not speak. She stood there facing me in complete silence. I turned on my headlamp. She was not there. Empty ground in front of the tree. I swept the light in every direction, into the surrounding forest, along both sides. There was nothing there. No sound of someone running or pushing through brush. No retreating footsteps. Nothing. I was standing on 2 feet on rocky forest soil. I had walked 40 feet from my tent in full wakefulness. I had spoken a word and received a visual response, the turn of a body toward me. And then I turned on a light, and there was nobody there. I went back to my tent and sat against the interior wall with my knife until morning. In the morning, I walked to that tree. On the bark, running vertically in parallel lines, from about shoulder height down to waist level, there were fresh scratches, deep ones. Pale inner wood exposed under the outer bark, the kind of marks that fingernails dragged downward with force would make. They had not been there when I'd made camp the previous evening. I had sat near that tree. There is no explanation I can build for this. I've tried multiple times and I always get stuck in the same place. A person turned and faced me. I saw that happen. And then the light came on and the space was empty. Those two things both happened. They cannot both be accommodated by any explanation I know. Story 10. I want to start by saying my friend Elliot knows I'm submitting this and is fine with it. He asked me to make clear that he has no explanation for what happened either, and that he thinks about it more than he'd like to. We drove up to a primitive camping area in Pisgah National Forest on a Thursday afternoon in July, planning a 4-night stay. Walk-in primitive sites, first come, first served most of the time, rarely busy on weekdays. We'd been to this general area before on a different trip, but not to this specific cluster of sites. When we pulled into the small gravel area and got out of the truck, there was a man sitting on a log at the edge of the nearest campsite, not at an adjacent site. At our intended site, on a log that was there as a part of the site furnishings, watching us. He was maybe 65, dressed in Carhartt-type work pants and a plain long-sleeve shirt and work boots. No visible pack, no camping gear anywhere around him, no vehicle that we could see. Just a man sitting on a log watching us unload our truck. We both noticed him immediately, and neither of us said anything for a second because the situation required processing. Elliot recovered first and said hello. The man didn't reply. He watched us. I walked over. I asked if he was camping there. He looked at me for what I would describe as an extended and deliberate pause before he said, "No, he wasn't camping." I asked what he was doing there. He said, "Waiting." I asked, "Waiting for what?" He looked past me at our truck and our gear and Elliot, taking in the scene slowly, and then he said, "For you to leave." The tone was completely flat, not aggressive, not hostile. He said it the way you'd say the sky was gray. "This is what I'm doing out here in the woods. I'm waiting for you to leave." Elliot had come up beside me and asked the man if he lived nearby. The man said no. Then he stood up from the log very slowly and walked north into the tree line and disappeared. We stood at the edge of that site and looked at where he'd gone, and neither of us spoke for a minute. Then we made a decision together, not explicitly in words, but in action, that we weren't going to let a strange man determine where we camped. We set up at that site. First night around 10, Elliot grabbed my arm. He was looking at the northern tree line, 20 yards from our fire. A shape, standing at the edge of the trees, not moving, just standing in the dark at the margin of the firelight. I aimed my flashlight at it. Empty tree line. Second night, same time, same location. I saw it first. Shape at the tree line. Flashlight. Nothing there. Third and fourth nights, nothing. We left Sunday morning without incident. Waiting for you to leave? If he wanted the campsite, he could have said so. If he was a local with some legitimate problem about the area, he could have said that too. What bothers me is the flatness of it. Not waiting for you to go, not you need to leave, waiting for you to leave. Like it was something already in process when we arrived. Like he'd been waiting before we got there and planned to continue waiting until we were gone. And he had a particular way of waiting that involved standing in a dark tree line just outside the reach of firelight. I've been to Pisgah many times since. I've never seen him again. I've never found an explanation that satisfies me. Elliot and I have developed a habit of checking the tree lines before we go to sleep when we camp together. Probably not a healthy habit, but it's one we both seem to need now. Quick break to say, if you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. I put out new videos every week and I never run out of material, which honestly says a lot about what's out there in those mountains. Story 11, River Camp. Submitted by Stephanie, 41, West Virginia. I paddle a lot. It's my primary thing, the way some people run or cycle. I've been paddling since my early 20s, starting with whitewater and expanding into multi-day flat water float trips that use the river as a linear trail through backcountry. I know the New River and Greenbrier River systems in West Virginia well enough to have opinions about specific bends and takeouts and the quality of gravel bars for camping. 4 days on the Greenbrier, solo. Midsummer 4 years ago. Good water levels, not technical paddling. Just moving quietly downriver for 4 days with enough gear in the stern for comfortable camping. The kind of trip where you don't see roads or buildings for most of the day. First 2 nights were everything a river trip should be. Clean gravel bars, good fires, a black bear on the far bank at sunset on day 2, which is one of my favorite things that can happen on any river. I slept both nights with the sound of the Greenbrier moving past a few feet from my tent. Third night, I pulled off at a large gravel bar and river left. Plenty of space, good flat ground above the high water line, clear view in both directions on the river. Cooked dinner, let the fire burn down. Went to sleep around 10. Something woke me up in the deep part of the night. Not a dramatic sound. Almost the opposite. A change in the ambient quality of the river sound, like the water had somehow gone quieter. Rivers don't do that without a physical reason, and there was no physical reason. I looked out through the tent fly. My fire was coals. On the far bank of the river, across 60 yards of dark water, there were 3 lights. Close together at the water's edge on the opposite bank, small, steady, not flickering the way flame does, not the warm orange of fire, pale and consistent, somewhere between white and yellow. 3 of them in a cluster, low to the ground. I watched them for a long time without moving. They didn't change. I got out of my tent and walked down to the water's edge and looked across at them. From that angle, I could make out the far bank in a rough silhouette, but I couldn't see any person or any structure associated with the lights. They were just there. The steadiness bothered me. Lights carried by people move. They bob and swing and shift because people move. These lights were absolutely consistent in a way that was hard to categorize. I watched for around 20 minutes. Then the left light went out. A minute later, the right one, then the middle one. In that sequence, one by one, like a deliberate process of extinguishing. Total darkness on the far bank. In the morning, I paddled over, 3 minutes to cross. I pulled my boat up on the gravel and walked the bank at the area where the lights had been. No camp, no fire ring, no gear, no footprints in the soft mud at the waterline. What was there? 3 small circles of stones, each about 6 inches in diameter, each filled with a pile of compacted ash. 3 tiny individual fire rings, each containing ash that was still structured, still compacted, the way ash looks before weather has had time to spread and gray it. Those fires had burned within hours of when I saw the lights. The stones were arranged the same distance apart as the lights had been. Someone had crossed that river in the night, built 3 tiny fires on the gravel bar, let them burn long enough to produce the ash I was looking at, and then extinguished them in sequence from left to right, and left with no trace visible except the stones and the ash. I finished my 4-day trip. I haven't been back to that stretch of the Greenbrier. I should. It's a good river, and I shouldn't let a thing I can't explain take it from me. But I haven't gone back. Not yet. Story 12. Trail crew submitted by James M., 36, Virginia. I've been doing volunteer trail maintenance with an Appalachian Trail Conservancy program for 8 years. Mostly long weekend work trips where a crew of 6 to 10 people goes into the backcountry, stays at a shelter site, and spends 2 days doing serious physical work. Brushing overgrown sections, clearing blowdowns, repairing drainage structures. It's good, hard, satisfying work, and I recommend it to anyone with the physical ability to do it. This particular work trip was on a remote section of the AT in Virginia in late September, a stretch that doesn't get much traffic outside of thru-hiker season. 7 volunteers, a full weekend planned. We based out of a shelter site that was a solid 4 miles from the nearest road. Second evening of the trip, the crew had put in a long day of chainsaw work on a blowdown section, and everyone turned in around 9:30, maybe 10. I stayed at the fire. I'm usually the last one to bed on work trips. The hour alone at the fire after everyone else goes in is one of the better parts of the experience. Around 10:15, I heard someone coming up the side trail that connected to the shelter site from the main AT. Footsteps, one person, unhurried pace. I figured it was a thru-hiker looking for the shelter, not unusual even at that hour. A man walked into the light of my fire, 50s I guess, medium build. Jeans, flannel shirt, work boots, no pack, no trekking poles, no headlamp. He walked out of the dark into the firelight, the way you'd walk into a room you'd been in before. He looked at me and said, "Which way to Roanoke?" I told him he was approximately 35 miles from Roanoke. I told him we were on a foot trail with no road access within miles in any direction. He looked at the fire, and then at the shelter, and then at the gear stacked around the site, and then back at me. He hadn't responded to anything I said. He asked again. Same words, same tone. "Which way to Roanoke?" I pointed in the general direction of the nearest highway, which was 5 or 6 miles through roadless forest. He nodded slowly. Then he walked in the direction I had pointed, into the tree line, off trail, directly uphill into dense forest, in the dark, without a light, without hesitation, without picking his way carefully, just walking into the trees at a steady pace until I couldn't hear him anymore. In the morning, I told our crew leader, Carol, who has been doing AT maintenance for close to 20 years. I expected skepticism. She didn't look skeptical. She told me she had encountered 2 similar incidents over her years on the trail. People appearing at unusual hours with no gear, asking simple and misdirected questions in a way that felt wrong, and then departing in a direction that made no navigational sense. She told me what she tells herself about it, which is that some people who live very remote lives in Appalachian country have a relationship with those mountains that people from outside can't fully read. I thought about that for a while. I still think about the man walking uphill into solid, dark, roadless forest in work boots and a flannel shirt and no light, at a pace that suggested he knew every rock. I think about it every time I'm at a fire alone after the crew has turned in. Story 13. The Kid, submitted by Lauren, 33, Kentucky. I'm submitting this with some hesitation because it involves a child, and I genuinely don't know what to do with that. I've been sitting on it for almost a year. My friend Deanna was with me, and she doesn't like to talk about it and doesn't want to submit it herself, but she said I could tell my version. We were doing a daytime loop hike in the Red River Gorge last spring. Just Deanna and me, no overnight, a loop we'd done before. The first couple of miles have enough foot traffic that we were passing other hikers regularly, families mostly, a lot of day visitors. About 3 miles in, the trail narrows and drops into a hollow that's a bit below the main traffic. The vegetation gets dense on both sides, and we hadn't passed another group for probably 40 minutes when we came around a bend and there was a child standing in the middle of the trail. A boy, 8 or 9 years old, my best estimate. Jeans, sneakers, a plain gray hoodie, standing completely still facing us. No adult behind him. No adult voice calling from anywhere ahead or behind. No sound of other people anywhere in the vicinity. Deanna went immediately warm and friendly, said hi, and asked where his parents were. The boy didn't answer her. He was looking at us, but not at our faces exactly. His gaze was moving between us in a way that felt more like assessment than attention. I asked if he was okay. He pointed up the trail in the direction we'd just come from and said clearly, without any hesitation, "You should go back." Deanna said we still had a ways to go. He said it again, same words, same flat delivery. "You should go back." Deanna asked for his name. No answer. Then he stepped off the trail to the right into the laurel thicket. And when I say stepped into it, I want to be precise. He moved into dense mountain laurel that was growing in a wall of interlocking branches at the trail edge, and he went through it without pushing through it. There was no thrashing, no sound of branches catching and releasing. He walked into that wall of laurel and he was gone, and the laurel didn't move the way it should have moved. Deanna and I stood on the trail for a while. I pushed the laurel branches aside to look in. Dense coverage in every direction. The kind you'd need gloves and determination to get through more than a few feet. No child visible. No sound of movement. We had a disagreement about what to do. I wanted to physically locate him. Deanna wanted to turn around, partly because of what he'd said and partly because the way he'd gone into that thicket was more unsettling to her than she wanted to admit out loud. We compromised and went forward to complete the loop, reasoning that if he was a child from a nearby group, he'd find his way back. The rest of the hike was completely normal. We didn't see him again. At the trailhead, there were no frantic parents, no search activity, no indication that anyone was looking for a missing child. I checked online over the following days for any news about a child lost or found in that area around that date. Nothing. The way he moved through the laurel is what I keep returning to. I've been through laurel thickets, and they don't let you pass quietly. They grab you, they slow you down. This child walked into a dense wall of mountain laurel and produced no sound and was not visible on the other side. I don't have an explanation for that. Deanna doesn't either, and it bothers her, and she knows it bothers her, and she still doesn't want to talk about it. That alone tells me a lot. Story 14. There are windows in the day in the Smoky Mountains that feel completely different from any other time. Anyone who has spent serious time there knows what I mean. Before dawn on a high trail, in certain hollows at dusk, in the deep cold of a winter morning after fresh snow, the mountains become something else in those windows, and the quality of the silence changes in a way that's hard to put words to. I've been chasing those windows for 20-something years. I do a pre-dawn summit push once every fall on a specific backcountry route in the Smokies that I've known since I was in my late 20s. I leave my car at a remote pull-off at 2:30 or 3 in the morning, hike by headlamp for a couple of hours to reach a high ridge, and arrive at a rocky outcrop in time for first light. The trail is steep and involves some off-trail scramble sections, and it's not something I'd recommend to someone who doesn't know the terrain. I know the terrain. Left my car at 2:45 in the morning. Cold and clear, no moon. I started up. About 45 minutes in, my primary headlamp died. I switched immediately to a small backup lamp, clipped to my pack strap. Dimmer than ideal, but workable for a trail I know by feel. In the few seconds between the primary dying and the backup coming on, I heard footsteps on the trail above me, coming down toward me, maybe 30 feet up the trail. The sound of boots on the rocky, rooted trail surface that I know from my own feet on this same ground. That specific combination of rock strike and earth compression. One person, moderate pace, moving downhill toward my position. Backup lamp came on. I aimed it up the trail. Nobody there. I kept climbing. The footsteps came back within 10 minutes. Same thing, same distance above me, same downhill movement. I stopped and listened, and they kept coming toward me, and I aimed my light up the trail and they stopped. At a point about 15 feet above my position, the footsteps ceased. They didn't pass me. The sound did not continue below me. They arrived at a point just above me and simply stopped existing. I have thought hard about what on that mountain could produce the sound of a person walking downhill on rocky trail. An animal that moved bipedally at that pace would be heavy enough to make other sounds. The trail surface was not loose enough for the kind of rock rolling or settling that might create rhythmic sound. I don't have a mechanistic explanation. I made the summit just before first light and watched the sky go from black to gray to the first orange above the ridgeline to the east. Worth the effort in the dark and the cold, as it always is. Coming down in daylight, I reached the section of trail where I'd heard the footsteps. There was a stretch of maybe 20 feet where the trailside vegetation on both sides had been disturbed, not from wind or weather. The shrubs had been pressed outward and downward, the kind of compression you'd get from something very large standing or moving in a space too narrow for it. The branches were still bent. The deformation was recent. Nothing of the dimensions implied by that damage moves silently down a steep rocky trail in total darkness. Nothing that wide fights on that trail without being seen by a headlamp at 30 feet. I've done that route 15 times, and I have never seen that kind of vegetation damage on that section. Not before and not since. I carry 2 backup lights on every pre-dawn push now. I always will. I also still do the push, every fall without fail. Whatever was on that trail before dawn, I don't think it's a permanent resident of that route. I think I walked into something that was passing through in the dark, during one of those windows. When the mountain is something else, I'd rather know it's there than not know it's there. Story 15. The last time I went backpacking alone was 8 months ago. I'm still deciding whether I'm going to do it again. I want that sentence to carry its full weight, because I need you to understand what it means coming from me. I've been backpacking since I was 22 years old. I have a gear closet that represents more investment than my car. I've done solo trips in 6 states. I've been out in weather that most people would find genuinely dangerous, and I've never once cut a trip short or come home rattled in any lasting way. For me, going into the backcountry alone is the clearest form of mental reset that exists. It's the most reliable tool I have for getting my head right when the rest of life gets heavy. Right now, 8 months later, I'm not sure I'm going back out alone. That should tell you something about what happened in the Monongahela, Spruce Knob area. Early November. High elevation, cold, exposed terrain with old-growth forest in the protected hollows. I'd done sections of this country before, but not this particular western boundary route, which skirts the edge of the wilderness and drops into some heavily timbered drainages that don't see much foot traffic. 5 days plan. Days 1 and 2 are exactly what I go out there for. That clean brain feeling that comes after 48 hours without screens or noise or other people's needs. Good mileage both days, excellent campfire both nights, good sleep. Late afternoon on day 3, coming down into a drainage on the western side of a long ridge, I found the camp. There wasn't much left of it. A fire ring old, the stones partially collapsed, and dark with years of use, the ash underneath long since cold and grayish white. A length of paracord tied between 2 trees at about shoulder height, still taut enough to have held a ridgeline, cut at one end. The cut was made with a blade, clean, not chewed through by an animal. And beside the fire ring, placed with care, a pair of work boots. Lace-up boots, size 10 or 11, both upright, both laces still tied. Set side by side like someone had taken them off to sleep and hadn't come back for them. I stood there for a long time. Work boots are a specific thing. Nobody removes their boots in the backcountry and walks away without them. There is no benign scenario I can construct for that image. I tried for a while and couldn't finish any of them. The boots were weathered, the leather cracked and stiff, but not ancient. A season or 2 old, maybe. I moved on and made camp further into the drainage, about 2 miles from the old site. Night 3, I went to sleep around 10. Woke up at 11 to a sound I couldn't immediately categorize. A dragging sound. Intermittent, lasting a few seconds at a time, heavy like something dense being pulled across leaf-covered ground. Then silence for 30 seconds or a minute, and then the dragging again from a different direction. The direction was the key detail. The first occurrence was somewhere north of camp. The second was east. The third was south. Over the course of roughly an hour, the sound made a complete circuit of my camp, always at the same general distance from my tent, never getting closer, never going further away, just moving around me in a slow, irregular orbit. I sat up through it with my knife and my trekking pole in my hands, and I cataloged every sound in every direction. There was nothing mechanical about it, no quality of machinery or rolling rock or anything inanimate. It had the quality of something being pulled by something else. The pauses felt deliberate. The changes in direction felt deliberate. It stopped at midnight, roughly. 1 minute there was a dragging sound to my northwest, and then it was gone, and the forest was the forest again. Night 4, the same thing. beginning around 11:15, the dragging from north of camp, then east, then the circuit again. Slightly different path than the night before, but the same methodology. The same slow orbit, ended around midnight. I broke camp on the morning of day 4 and came out a day early, 8 hours of hiking. I came out partly in the dark because I'd started late, too unsettled after the second night to move efficiently in the morning. What I couldn't stop thinking about on the way out was the boots. They'd been there long enough to weather. Whatever had been circling my camp those 2 nights had also been the reason someone walked out of that drainage without their boots, or didn't walk out at all. There is something in that section of the Monongahela that has been out there long enough to have a territory, long enough that the boots were old when I found them, and the paracord had been cut by someone who isn't there anymore. And it spent 2 nights circling my camp slowly and patiently, the way something circles when it has all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. I don't know if it's still there, and it probably is. That's all 15 for tonight. Every one of those came from someone's real life. I don't editorialize and I don't embellish. If it came in, it goes out as close to the original words as possible. Links to the submission form and last week's video are below. I'll see you next week.